for a long time, and they're continuing aggressively through the United Nations Population Fund, my own agency, my own government's, our own government's Agency for International Development, to push population control on the Philippines. So that's the first question. The second question is, deals with the rise and fall of the world's peoples. So now let's go to the next slide. I don't have a little switch here, so I just have to sort of announce what I'm going to go to next. This is, nope, we don't want to go there yet. We want to stop at this one and let everybody see this graph. And now anyone who has read a social science, economics textbook, beginning in junior high school, or college, has seen a graph like this. It shows human population very low in 1000 BC, still low around the birth of Christ, and then as we close into our own time, it suddenly accelerates. And usually you see the graph just spiking up terrifyingly, as if we were about to breed ourselves off the face of the planet. Now, many people have been gripped by graphs like this, including Prince Philip of Great Britain, who founded in 1989 the World Wildlife Federation, and said at that time that he would like to be reincarnated as a virus so he could come back and kill off humanity, which was desecrating the planet. Now, I don't know what the Archbishop of Canterbury had to say about that, but nonetheless, this is what people think is happening. Now, let's move on to the next slide. And this is what has really happened over the last half century. We have seen from 1960 to the year 2000 a doubling of the world's population. All right? Why did the world's population double from 1960 to the year 2000? Was it because people all over the world started breeding like rabbits? No. No. The birth rate was falling throughout this time. What happened, beginning at the end of World War II, with the advent of modern medicine and foreign aid programs that in the beginning were focused on primary health care and reducing deaths from malaria, typhus, typhoid, and pneumonia, and all the rest. What happened after World War II was a dramatic fall in death rates around the world, especially death rates among the elderly and infant and child mortality death rates. And so, as death rates fell rapidly, the population doubled. It didn't double again because people started having more children. The birth rate was falling, but the death rate was falling even faster. And so what we had was a one-time doubling of the world's population. Now, Paul Ehrlich, the original population bombster, who was a colleague of mine at Stanford University in the late 1970s, wrote a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb. Many of you have heard of this book. Some of you may have been forced to read it in college. I actually believed it at the beginning. He, at the beginning of the 1960s, saw the birth rate, rather the population growth rate increasing this way and thought, oh my goodness, we have a big problem and we have to energize the governments of the world to fight population growth. What he didn't realize is that this was a one-time doubling. It's a one-time doubling because lifespans went from less than 40 years worldwide, on average, to almost 70 today. Again, people were dying in their late 30s on average, globally, after World War II. Today, they're living until almost 70. That's the worldwide lifespan average. We have almost doubled the lifespans of people on the planet. That is a great victory over death. That's not something we should despair over. That's not something that we should say, that's a population problem. We've got to stop so many people from living so long. That's something we should celebrate. That's something we should celebrate. I mean, the best and most fundamental, basic measure of human well-being is how long people live. If you're living better, if you have better housing, if you have better medical care, you're going to, by and large, live longer. So this is what happened there. This is should not be used, as it has been, as an excuse for declaring a population problem, because we're going to go to the next slide. We're going to see that we had this one-time doubling, but the world's population will never double again. Now you see where we are now, and the graph then, today, goes in 4 different directions. You can ignore the top 3 lines. The bottom line is what you want to look at. The bottom line is the United Nations Population Division's projection of what will happen if birth rates continue on their present trajectory. If birth rates in Europe continue to be low, if birth rates in Asia continue to be low, if birth rates in Latin America continue to be low, we are going to see population peak in about 2040 at 8 billion or so, giving on how many children you have and your grandchildren have, and then it's going to decline. The other projections are unrealistic. They show birth rates suddenly spiking up for no reason that is given. So population levels off around 2040, which is only about 30 years in the future, and then begins to decline. Let's go on to the next slide. Many nations are already in absolute population decline. All of the nations in Europe, even except tiny Albania, have fertility too low to sustain the current population. Europe is dying. And you know, as bad as the recession is in this country, the European recession is worse because they don't have any young people. 15 countries in Europe are actually losing people from year to year. Russia, Vladimir Putin has declared that Russia is in the middle of a demographic crisis because it's losing 750,000 people a year. Russia is now paying young couples $9,000 to have a baby. $9,000. That's the highest baby bonus I know of in the world. Now, it may have occurred to some of you that Russia would be a good place to give birth. Well, it's only a one-time bonus. So, and Russia's borders are not nearly as porous as ours, so I don't know how that would work. But we actually have, now, all of the European countries have child bonuses in place. Russia's just happens to be the largest. But Italy, Spain, and Germany, and Austria, and France, and Great Britain, they all pay child bonuses. In the German-speaking countries, they pay Kindergeld, which is child money. You get, for each child, you get several hundred marks a year, or euros a year, or a month from the government. We actually do it better here in the United States, okay? We do it better here in the United States because in Europe, the idea that they're using to boost fertility is, well, first of all, we're going to take 50 to 60% of your income in taxes. Because remember, we have cradle-to-grave welfare systems in European states. And then we're going to give you, if you have children, a fraction of that back. Now that's not a very good idea. It's very inefficient. Because whenever you give the government money, it's very reluctant to give it back. In the United States, we have a tax credit, as you all know, of $1,000 per child. And so instead of giving the money to the government and then expecting it to give it back, which is painful, we protect young couples from the onerous burdens of taxation, in part, if they have children. So that young couples of modest income with 2 or 3 children generally don't pay very much in taxes. Now, I believe they should be sheltered from taxes altogether. I believe this tax credit only applies to the income tax. I don't think that young couples who are willing to have children, willing to get married and have children, should have to pay into the Social Security program either. Why? Because they're raising future taxpayers who are going to help keep Social Security afloat in the future. They're contributing to the welfare of the United States in the most fundamental way by providing the next generation. That's something governments can't do. They can do a lot of things, but they cannot produce the next generation. That's up to us, people who are open to life. In Asia, you've got Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan actually dying. Now, Japan's birth rate has been below replacement for a long, long time because abortion was legalized in Japan in 1954. And by 1964, the birth rate in Japan, the average number of children per woman was down to about 2.1, which is replacement. And since 1964, it's been below that. It's now averaging, the average Japanese family now has about 1.3 children. And one of the most odd suggestions I've heard, historically ironic suggestions I've heard made on the part of the Japanese government, is that because there are so few young people and caregivers in Japan to care for the increasing number of elderly, that they were going to open a series of retirement centers and old age homes in the Philippines where there were lots of young people to care for the elderly Japanese. Now, I don't know if that's actually happened. It's happened. But isn't it interesting that, that 55 years after the end of World War II, that the Japanese would now be back and asked to be cared for by the Filipinos? Let's go to the next slide. Points to remember. When someone tells you the world's population is exploding, tell them no, the world's population will never double again. Tell them that half the population of the world is already at or below replacement. What I mean by that is half the population of the world is already having too few babies to maintain the current population. And of course, there's the one-time doubling from 1960 to 2000. Tell them not to misunderstand that. That's not going to happen again. So let's go on to the next one. Now, what about Asia? Well, large families are becoming rare in Asia. That actually happens to be a picture of my family, by the way. And of course, in China, where we've had a one-child policy in place since 1980, when I was there, we have now, and one-child policy in the cities, they had to relax it in the countryside a little bit. They relaxed the one-child policy in the countryside because so many little girls were being killed at birth. Even back in 1980, when I was there for the first time, little girls were dying in mysterious circumstances shortly after birth. And I would ask the midwife what was happening, and I found out, after making inquiries, that many couples were saying, I'm only now allowed to have one child. The government says so. My parents, my husband, desperate to have a son to carry on the family name, to work in the fields after we retire. A daughter won't suffice because a daughter will grow up and then marry out and go to support someone else's family. And so because of those, the combination of traditional attitudes preferring sons, on the one hand, traditional patriarchal, patrilineal attitudes that stem from the Confucian mindset on the one hand, and the one-child policy on the other, little girls were caught in a death loop. And many of them were put to death deliberately after birth by being dunked in a pail of water, smothered before they had a chance to catch their first breath. Or in some cases, abandoned by the sides of roads and left to die of exposure. These weren't isolated cases. By the mid-1980s, there were 1 million baby girls missing each year. You could study the sex ratios at birth of Chinese children and see that there were 1 million little girls who were not there, who had been eliminated. And so the government of China said, without admitting any fault, and I believe they do have fault, it is the God-given right of couples to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children, not governments. The Chinese government said to people in the countryside, if your first child is a girl, don't put her to death, because we will give you a second chance to have a son. And so in the countryside, you have a de facto two-child policy in some places. In other places, the original rule is still abided by. If the first child is a son, you have to stop at 1. If the first child, however, is a little girl, then you're given permission 4 years later to have another chance at having a son. Now, has this solved the problem of female infanticide? No. It has simply put second-born baby girls at risk. And something else has happened in China today. The ultrasound machine has allowed sex-selective abortion to take place in China. so that couples who are desperate for a son will go in at 5.